Hi everybody, Brian Walker, CEO, founder of Retail Doctor Group, and I love this segment about the future of retail. And through our podcast, we've had some fantastic speakers. And there's one guy that's really caught my eye and ear in the last while. He's a guy called Steve Sammartino. He's a futurist, he's a technology economist, and an economist, of course. But, I'm going to talk with Steve this morning, and we're going to cover a range of topics. Without any further ado, Steve, good morning.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's great to be here.
Great to have you with us. How did you get to become a technology economist and a futurist?
Well, the futurist bit tends to happen to you. One of my rules is people need to call you that quite a bit before you call yourself it. I'm actually an economist by trade and have been very interested in technology from a really young age. I wrote my first lines of computer code at around about the age of 10 before most people even knew about PCs or computers or the internet. I think I was on the internet in 1989, with a dial-up modem on a ring phone. And I studied economics. I worked in corporate for about 10 years. And then in the early 2000s, I went and did some software startups where I built and sold some software companies and worked in startups. And as you know, many industrial companies had to really understand we're going through a transition. Retail, obviously, at the pointy end of that revolution. And what happened was a lot of my ex-colleagues in corporate, more traditional manufacturing and industrial concerns kept inviting me in to say, Steve, you've worked with us and you've done startups and tech. Can you help us with this whole digital revolution? And then I just started thinking and writing and speaking about what was happening in the economy and how business models were changing. And people started calling me a futurist. And I guess, combining my corporate experience, my formal qualifications in economics, and my proclivity to write code and do software and tech stuff just kind of came together in a bit of a Venn diagram overlap. And then I just kind of evolved from there, and people just keep getting me to help them. And now I just think, write, and speak about technology.
Well, let's start there. When we think about, the world of artificial intelligence, machine learning, the sort of the idea that anything algorithmic is the domain of AI as a starting point. And then we start to think about what you touch on with the dichotomy economy. Picture for me 2030, if you would. AI is well enhanced. Every application has AI of some description. We see this splitting almost of the classic model of retail. That is this large scale AI machinery, all the things no doubt you'll touch on. And perhaps we see the artisan, but I'm curious about what that looks like.
I mean, the first thing that I think about with 2030, and I think we'll be in a bit of a transition in these next 5 or 6 years, where I like to say that technology is horizontalizing. And I'll explain that for the listeners. We've had AI for a long time. It was first coined as a phrase in 1952, but most AIs have been, let's call them verticals. They operate in verticals and they're isolated, and they're almost like all these little islands. And so Google Maps is a great example where it can do one thing really well, and it is AI. It looks at the roads, the different ways to get somewhere, how long the roads are, the kilometers, the speed limits, how fast cars are going on those speed limits, and it gives you an indication of the best way to go. And it's constantly re-looking at that and will give you an alternative direction if there's traffic ahead. That's a singular vertical AI. And retail was like that too, was singular verticals. I'm a clothes retailer, I'm a food retailer, And what's happened with AI and is happening now over the next 5 or 6 years is that all of these separate nodes are being joined. So instead of having a lot of separate AIs that do singular things, we're getting neural networks which really have a sense of biomimicry about them. They operate a lot like the brain, where there's all of these little nodes that all connect and can interconnect and work together. And we actually call this the connectionist movement in AI. The other AIs were called symbolic, and symbolic means if this, do that. It's the simplest way to explain it in human language. It looks at something, calculates it, and gives you a direction to go in the code. But connection AIs looks for patterns and pattern recognition. And what that means is that it can integrate different parcels of information or data lakes and work with them together and create new sense in a holistic fashion, which is very similar to the way ecosystems and biological intelligence works. And because they're large language models and all of human knowledge is in language, what we can do is we can connect these things. So my view is the next 5 or 6 years will be AIs making connections with things that were previously disparate and joining them together. And that creates new opportunity for large business. And in many ways, small business now gets a chance to participate because the other AI was kind of exclusive and this is more generalized in nature. And because it's language based, we can literally write code and do things in the next 5 or 6 years that was once just the behest of coders. So all of a sudden, computers speak our language, and our imagination to join things together gives us potential to participate as a single person or a small business.
I remember you mentioning the dichotomy economy, this idea of the split of the retail landscape into the future. What, to fill that out a bit, if you would, Steve? I was interested.
Yeah, there's a real pattern that I think is emerging right now. And we've seen this a lot over the last decade or two, where businesses are less general and less mainstream, and they're getting pushed out into the extremes. I like to say we live in a world of Tiffany's and Costco. It's either super premium or super cheap. And you can even see these patterns in demographics, where the middle income is being eroded, middle Australia is being eroded, and around the world, that middle ground is kind of going away. And you can see it in the disparity in incomes. And so retailers that tend to be doing better are those that really play in one space, where they kind of are full service or no service, full price or super cheap. And these are the businesses that are doing well. And if we look at the richest people in the world, it's Sir Bernard Arnault, who owns LVMH, and Jeff Bezos, who has the everything store at super cheap prices. I mean, just look at that. The two richest people live in those two kind of extremes of wealth. And it's really evident once you look at it. And even from a tech perspective, you see the Apple store, which gets 5 times the price for the same microchips and the same screens, because it's full service, full price. And then you've got the Amazon Go store, which is no people in there, come in, just take things off the shelf. So that dichotomy economy is really evident in a lot of places, even unfortunately in the Australian housing landscape. It's people with 10 houses and people who can't afford a house.
Yeah, you know, I wonder as technology sort of pervades and this dichotomy economy plays out, and if I think about the Amazonian models, the Shein, the Temu, the technology forward companies.
Yes.
Amazon currently in our country is doing about $6.5 billion a year, forecast to do over 20 billion by about this 2027, 28 window, if that happens. What's interesting to me is that, well, a couple of things. At what point does this idea that the tactile and physical and the social experience occur in the physical space and the virtual, accessible, commoditized experience occurs on the online? But technology is only going to enhance, isn't it? And I think even Amazon are playing around with this concept of making the virtual far more physical and far more readily available. Will technology take us into a place where that's much grayer? That I could have a physical experience or as close to emulating? And we're seeing very crude forms of it now with try-on sizes online and things like that. But that can only get better, yeah? Augmented reality, virtual reality.
Yeah. I think augmented and virtual reality will eventuate as a next step for traditional e-commerce, where it becomes more personal and it becomes more interactive. But I think that humans in the world that we live in at the moment is irrevocably physical, right? And we like physical things and interacting with humans in human spaces. I actually see this opportunity where you're going to continue to see online, cheap. Yes, they'll try and make it better. And I think we're a little way off with that virtual and augmented reality. But I think in physical stores, we're going to see that interaction become more and more important. And the imperfections and the slowness and the human nature actually becomes a human benefit that people will pay a premium for, right? And an interesting example that I think has already emerged is in entertainment and music. And I like to use that as an example because art usually tells the story of retail. Like if we look to art and music, it's always on the bleeding edge of what happens next because artists are explorers. Right now, I can get the most perfect version of a Taylor Swift song for free online. It totally perfect. Yet I can't get a ticket to see her at the MCG, or couldn't, to see an imperfect version of her singing live and viscerally. And so the things that are going to be most profitable, I think, and have the biggest margin are going to be because a human is doing it and because you're interacting with humans. And so in that sense, retail then becomes more social, more entertaining, and the process of the acquisition is actually the thing you're buying more than the thing itself. So I think that we're going to have, let's call it a slow food movement. So we realized that we want a barista to make our coffee, and food not being irradiated and microwaved and instant and frozen, which was the future of the 60s and 70s, kind of eroded, and we went back. And sometimes it takes us a generation to realize there's something really beautiful in the physicality. And this isn't being anti-tech. Tech still exists and it's amazing, and we have it over there, but you have this separation. But it usually takes us a generation to realize that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree, but I also think, this idea of retailing growing up with the customer initiating the purchase. If I think at the sort of more value volume end, I start to wonder, particularly maybe even in all categories, Steve, I start to wonder about who initiates over time.
Okay.
So, of course, if we've got such great algorithmic tracking of an individual, we're able to anticipate and we're able to predict and we're able to be the initiator of that transaction. And we're seeing that already, aren't we?
Yeah.
And do you think that will continue?
Yeah, I do. Look, it will. And it will with the majority of things. You're absolutely right, because humans tend to go towards a path, and that path, we're more predictable than we'd like to think we are.
Absolutely.
We are absolutely creatures of habit. And what we do is we leave, I mean, it's classic. Cookies is one of the first things that we, tracking devices we had on the early internet in the earlier mid-90s. And that still remains true. We leave clues and crumbs of where we're going, and it's actually easy to see where we want to go. And that'll become super efficient. And sometimes it's a gift of understanding to get suggested something that you want, which saves you the search and gets you where you want to go really quickly. Because it's like, especially with transactions which are commodity based, I actually just want to get it done and get on with my human life. And that's a gift. And I think that'll be 80% of the equation. But there's one thing that algorithms never do well, and algorithms can't predict boredom and when boredom will set in. And humans get bored really easy. One of the things that, and you'll notice, anyone will notice this in their own shopping habits, where you shop for a family and everyone's loving yogurt and we're eating yogurt and we cannot get enough yogurt and we're smashing it. And then whoever does the shop that week, the next week, there's 6 tubs of yogurt and they all just end up in the shelf of broken dreams with an expired use-by date, because we just said, it's enough yogurt for now. I'm done on yogurt. Now I want the next thing. That's something in an algorithm gets wrong, has always got wrong, and will always get wrong. And fashion and food and these other things, that's going to be that 20%. That's going to be that human element. Yes, absolutely. 80% of prediction will be there, things that are inevitable. But there's going to be that always that little interesting bit. Maybe it's a bit of a Pareto 80-20. I think that 20% is always going to be there.
That if it was reduced at this sort of fundamental human level to 20%, if you like, Steve, that will revolutionize this concept of traditional physical shops, shopping centers. Do you see that as a consequence of this technology evolution and march?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, you can already see it now, and I love walking around at shopping centers and main streets and airports and just really watching the patterns. And if you look closely for it, you can see something appear before it appears in the financial papers or in the trend spotting. If you pay attention, you can see which stores are busy, which ones are not as busy, where the foot traffic is. And you can already see the commoditized consumption in retail. It's a bit hard. It's you can see that sort of declining in some areas, but stuff that is social and interactive and experiential, that's where all the foot traffic is. And
Yep.
yeah, we're sort of getting back there. It's almost like, remember that markets used to be, yeah, they called them bazaars. It was a bazaar. And you go there because it's interesting things. It's like, what am I going to find? You know, spices from the different world. And here's a product that's from Italy. And wow, I mean, you could never see that. Now the bazaar is who's here and why are they here and what are they doing rather than what are they buying. And I think that's going to continue to emerge.
And so if I link us back to this AI topic, particularly, Steve, are you in the school that thinks ultimately AI will be able to mimic human emotion very, very skillfully? And if so, I wonder what that might mean for the social experience.
So I want to dig deeper on the mimic human physicality. Tell me more what you mean about that, because I kind of have this view that whatever AI can't do today can probably do it tomorrow. But I'm interested in what you mean exactly. So we're going to have to do this collectively, I think.
Well, that's the adage, Steve, that, you know, ultimately AI will develop such advanced algorithms that it will ultimately be able to replicate a human being's feeling. So in other words, it could take stamped images or templates of a human face and in a nanosecond have a library of human expressions, sadness, happiness, whatever it might be, empathy, and be able then to play back that in a robotic form. Now, this is getting right out into the future, but
yeah. So you mean like a robot in a retail environment or on a screen be able to interact with you, and you would feel like that's a human speaking to you?
Yes, absolutely, because we're seeing the very first crude examples of that in some of the chatbots, aren't we?
Yeah. Okay. So my answer to that is absolutely yes, and we're probably already there. It may not be available to everyone at this point, but AIs already have something which we call an NND, a no noticeable difference. So very, very difficult to understand whether or not that's a human. We already have AIs which can use voice, which is incredibly compelling, even with the and the pause. Let me think about that. It's all very nuanced at the moment. And in terms of visuals, on screen with an AI that actually isn't even a person, that has just been invented by AI. We already have that. That already exists. And I would even go one step further, where we'll have humanoid robots with soft exoskeletons and micro movements within flesh-like silicons, where unless you touched it, you wouldn't know. And I think that'll happen before the end of the decade. That's how close we are.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? So I rock up to my local barista who knows me by name, knows my coffee, knows my history, except purchases coffee, what have you, makes a magnificent coffee, and it's a robot.
100%. If you want the robot, now this is where it gets interesting, because I think sometimes we're going to want the Taylor Swift and not the robot Taylor Swift.
So what if you can't tell the difference? Exactly.
Yeah, well,
but what if you can't tell the difference?
Well, here's the thing. We think about fine dining. The fact that it's a human doing it and coming up and serving us is actually maybe the thing that you want more, even if a robot could do it. And I think artificial intelligence, whether in physical or virtual form, will become price competitive. And then sometimes we want to spend more because we can, and mostly it serves our ego rather than our needs. And I think that a large portion of purchases in the premium categories are egocentric rather than need-centric. Think about a car. You know, a car, I can probably buy a pretty decent Toyota or secondhand car that's not that much different from a fancy Mercedes, really, other than what lives in my mind. And that kind of exists, but definitely 100% humanoids in retail serving us with no noticeable difference. And maybe it makes the experience cheaper and it'll give more people more access to more things. And that might be a good thing. Like, it's definitely going to happen. That's for sure.
Well, Steve, yeah, I take your point though. I think it's going to depend a little bit on the category, but at the end of the day, if there's no definable difference or discernible difference, and we can bring this or retailers bring this technology in, well then, you know, it has all the efficiencies of process that we don't offer. So that's a fascinating insight. And I wonder what that ultimately leads to.
Look, I think in a lot of retail, we will use humanoid robots. I can't imagine a future of a supermarket or a pharmacy where we would get a human to fill the shelves up if a humanoid robot can do it better, more efficiently, understand the stock, even know when the stock's changing and when to do it. I think in a lot of restaurants and other areas, if we could have humanoid robots implementing those tasks, I think we'll do it. It'll make prices cheaper and more accessible and increase volume. And I think the competitive dynamics to reduce cost will enable that. And it won't be, maybe even make the retail operate better, more efficiently, serve more customers and make more customers happy. Probably be better at dealing with frustrated customers too. So I can't see that not happening in a large majority of places. But again, that microcosm of premium products will be humans, but I think the large majority will be AI ensconced robotics. And this is a really important part, Brian, is that we're about to get to this next part of the AI revolution, because AI has largely been in computers and on screens. What we're about to do is similar to what happened with the car, where we had a horse and cart for a really long time until we put the motor in it. That's when things changed with the combustion engine. We're about to put the intelligence into humanoid robots, where we have a merger of physical beings that escape from the screen and get put into physical things, whether it's an AI that's a car that's driving itself around. So you put the brain into the car, or where you put the brain into the physical robot. And we actually really need humanoid robots. I'll tell you why, because we've got a human-shaped world.
How do you mean, Steve? Can you elaborate?
Everything we've built since humans became the apex species on our planet is human-shaped. Doorways, stairways, cars, cities, buildings, everything is human-shaped. And if we want AI to be able to operate in the infrastructure we already have, then it's a requirement that the AIs don't just live on screens, they can actually physically move around that world and participate with us.
And or change that structure as well. Autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, but that takes time, because the physical world takes a really long time to change.
It's just so transformative from a societal perspective as well, isn't it, Steve? When we think about the arts, the sciences, the way societies are structured, the way they operate, you know, there's a massive amount of re-engineering of what work means. For another topic, for another day, but it's fundamentally so structural, isn't it?
It really is. And we can already see the complexity of this with the legal system lagging behind things on social media governance and free speech. And what do deep fakes mean when we have many elections around the world this year, and the world's first deep fake election in the US, where anyone can go onto a website like HeyGen and create a fake version of anyone or themselves for free that is way better than anything we had 12, 18, 24 months ago, that once required 200 people coding up fakes. It was really difficult to do, and now it's easy. So the social parameters of work, where money goes, should there be a tax on AIs and robotics? Like we now have payroll tax. Well, should there be robot tax? If someone has more robots, should they be taxed per robot? How do we redeploy people? How do we reskill the economy? The social questions are the really, really big ones.
They are the big questions. And Steve, as we start to wrap up, I'm just about to send my robot shopping for me.
It's funny.
Let's
a lot
say
of
the
people
Elon Musk's version of it all, hey?
Yeah, it is funny. I think that we'll see robo taxis. They've got a large amount implemented through the US now with Waymo, and we'll see them coming online in Australia and other markets really quickly. And that'll probably be our really first consumer-based interaction with robo taxis with AI. But, a lot of people ask really interesting questions to me when I do a keynote speech. And the most common question I get is, are you scared that robots will become very, very human? And I jokingly say, yeah, I'm really scared, because I would hate to have a robot at home and ask it to mow the lawns and it to say, well, you should do them yourself. Because if it gets really human, that's what it might say.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So, but I think that we just need to remember that we get a chance to shape the world that we live in. And the habits that we have will be the habits that we create at scale. And so we need to think about how we scale our habits and which ones we want to be scaled, and have the conversation so that we can shape the world that we live in, right? Because it's going to change radically, and we need to think about work and how AI influences the way we do commerce. Because I think about retail. Retail is everything. It really is, because retail is transactions that keep us alive. That's what it is.
And they satisfy all our senses in that sense as well. But, Steve, it was interesting, and sort of in moving towards the end. I mean, we could talk for hours, clearly, and every moment's fantastic. But, I was listening to and thinking about this idea that it's machine learning, and it picks up, ultimately all the good of society, but it also picks up all the not so good of society.
Yeah.
And I guess ultimately, if you take the view that the slightly dystopic view is that profit maximization will drive a lot of commerce and retail in time to come, naturally. And so what does that mean in terms of the retail experience of the future? What does it mean to the shift of the retail institutions that we have at the moment and the channels that we have at the moment? And who will be best placed? And increasingly, it becomes the land of the giants at one level, and then that niche at the middle. And I think you and I both would concur that middle ground is going to be challenging unless there's very quick adaptation and access to capital and so on.
Yeah, actually, access to capital is a really big point, because I think the big have got bigger because they get more access to capital.
Yeah.
But if there's any thing that is positive for us, is that we can see how quickly Google has had to reconfigure to cope with search moving to AI and going from a list of potentials to a singular answer, and they're scrambling. And OpenAI is going to launch an AI search engine. So just when you think it's impossible for the big to be unseated, usually they invent the technology which opens up the opportunity for new competitors. And we might be at the precipice of that. And this is for nimble people listening to this to really explore the potentiality of the technology to re-engage their consumers, the way they go to market with their retail, because there's usually always the seeds of the new opportunity when the new technology emerges.
Yeah, that's a wonderful note to end it on for today. Steve, I think we've got part 1 and part 2 already in today's discussion. And Steve Sammartino, I can't wait for part 3. And I encourage any of you out there, if you get a chance to read Steve's work, see him in presentation mode, a wonderful student of what it is that we call the future, and a wonderful orator as well. Thank you very much, Steve.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.